Some people just get opportunities handed to them. The teacher's voice was low, but the sting of his words carried through the room. Michelleobama heard it. She paused, her warm smile never fading, though a flicker of something deeper passed. Through her eyes, the students shifted, sensing the tension. The room, once buzzing with excitement, now held its breath. Would Michelle let it slide? Or was this teacher about to learn a lesson he'd never forget? Have you ever witnessed unfair treatment in a space meant to inspire? What would you do? Comment where you're watching from, like and subscribe for more powerful stories. The sprawling campus of Brookfield Academy shimmered under the morning sun, its polished glass windows reflecting an air of prestige. Inside, the corridors buzzed with excitement as students hurried to their seats in the grand auditorium, whispering about the guest speaker. Brookfield wasn't just any school. It was a symbol of excellence, with a reputation for producing future leaders. Michelleobama's arrival was met with an eruption of applause as she stepped out of the car, exuding warmth and poise. Principal Elena Carter stood at the entrance, her smile wide, but her hands slightly trembling. "Mrs. Obama," she greeted, extending her hand, "it's an absolute honor to have you here today." "The honor's mine," Michelle replied graciously, her voice steady yet inviting. She glanced at the school's crest above the main door, her mind briefly flashing back to her own school days, so far removed from the affluence around her now. As they walked through the hallways, Michelle noted the pristine decor, motivational, posters on the walls, polished marble floors, and rows of students lined up, their eyes sparkling with curiosity. But behind their smiles, a few faculty members exchanged unreadable glances, their expressions unreadable yet tense. The stage was set, both literally and figuratively. Something told Michelle this day would not go entirely as planned. The murmur of anticipation filled the auditorium as Michelleobama stepped onto the stage. The applause was deafening, but Michelle, ever humble, raised her hand with a warm smile, signaling for calm. "Thank you so much for that welcome," she began, her voice steady yet inviting. "Now, I don't know about you, but when I was your age, I never imagined standing in a place like this, let alone speaking to a group like you." A ripple of laughter broke out as she recounted a humorous story about struggling through math in high school. "There were days when I thought algebra was invented just to torture me," she joked, eliciting more laughter. Yet as she spoke, her words carried depth. She painted vivid pictures of her journey, from growing up in the south side of Chicago, surrounded by love but limited by systemic challenges, to working twice as hard to prove her worth in spaces that doubted her. "You see," Michelle continued, her tone softening, "it wasn't just about being good. It was about being excellent. Because for people like me, excellence wasn't optional. It was survival." Her authenticity resonated deeply with many students, their admiration palpable in their eager nods and focused gazes. But among the faculty, Mr. William Hart's stoic expression stood out. Arms crossed, his lips tightened as though he could hardly contain his skepticism. While Michelle's presence inspired hope in the students, it unsettled others who clung to their own prejudices. From the side of the auditorium, Mr. William Hart observed the scene with an expression of practiced neutrality, his presence commanding. Even without a word, a veteran teacher with decades of experience, he was respected among faculty for his strict standards and unwavering opinions. But as Michelleobama spoke, sharing her journey with the students, a faint shadow of disdain flickered across his face. When Michelle paused for questions, Hart saw his moment. Rising slowly, he cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the warm atmosphere like a blade. "Mrs. Obama," he began, his tone measured but pointed, "your story is certainly inspiring. But I'm curious, would you say your path to success was entirely based on merit? Or were there advantages along the way that others might not have had. The room fell silent. The question was delivered under the guise of intellectual inquiry, but the weight of its implication was clear. Students exchanged uncertain glances, some frowning at the audacity, others hesitant to challenge a figure of authority. Michelle met his gaze, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. "That's an interesting question," she replied, her voice steady, "and it's one I've faced many times before. But let me be clear. Every step of my journey was earned through hard work, resilience, and determination. If I've had any advantage, it's the belief instilled in me by my family that I could succeed even when others doubted me." Hart gave a thin-lipped smile, nodding as though unconvinced. His subtle microaggressions, framed as professional curiosity, hinted at deeper skepticism, setting the stage for a clash yet to come. Principal Elena Carter stood at the back of the auditorium, watching the exchange between Michelleobama and Mr. Hart unfold. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her, betraying the nervous energy she was trying to suppress. She had worked tirelessly to bring Michelle to Brookfield Academy, hoping to inspire her students with the former First Lady's story of resilience and success. But now she found herself frozen, unsure of how to respond to Hart's pointed remarks. Elena respected Hart. He was one of the longest-serving teachers at the school, with a reputation for challenging both students and colleagues alike. Yet beneath that respect lay a fear of confrontation. She knew his influence among the faculty was significant, and disrupting the harmony of the school, especially during such a high-profile event, felt like a risk she wasn't prepared to take. As Michelle answered Hart's thinly veiled skepticism with grace, Elena silently admired her composure, but she couldn't shake the nagging guilt that came with her silence. Wasn't it her role as principal to stand up for what was right? And yet, she remained rooted in place, hoping the situation wouldn't escalate further. Her internal conflict reflected a broader systemic issue. Even those with the best intentions often found themselves complicit, trapped by fear of rocking the boat. And in her hesitation, Michelle was left to fend for herself, a reality all too familiar for women like her. The students in the auditorium sat in rapt attention as Michelleobama continued her speech, her words flowing with a mixture of warmth and conviction. For many, her story resonated deeply. A young boy in the front row leaned forward, his eyes wide with admiration as Michelle recounted her journey of perseverance. A group of girls whispered excitedly, nodding to each other as her words affirmed their own dreams and struggles. But not everyone shared the same enthusiasm. Some students exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence in her story shaken by Mr. Hart's earlier remarks. His subtle cues, an arched eyebrow here, a disapproving shake of the head there, did not go unnoticed. A few students, eager to align themselves with authority, hesitated to fully embrace Michelle's message, unsure of whether they should admire her or question her success. Among the students sat Elena, a bright but reserved girl whose notebook was already filled with quotes from Michelle's speech. Her heart swelled with inspiration, but she hesitated to fully express her admiration. Standing out, even for something positive, felt risky in an environment where authority figures like Hart held so much influence. For Elena and many others, the moment was a delicate balancing act. The pull of inspiration weighed against the fear of stepping too far from the safety of conformity. At the side of the auditorium, Michelle's team observed the unfolding tension with a mix of admiration and unease. As seasoned professionals, they were used to accompanying her to events where she was met with overwhelming support. But moments like this, a respected authority figure challenging her so brazenly, still stung. "She's handling it," one of them whispered, her voice more to reassure herself than anyone else. "Of course she is," another replied, his arms crossed tightly. "She always does. But this isn't just about her. It's about those kids. What kind of message is that? Teacher sending them? The team exchanged concerned looks, their focus shifting between Michelle's poised demeanor and the students' reactions. They could see the division in the room, the awe on some faces, the hesitation on others. It was clear that Hart's remarks weren't just about discrediting Michelle, but also about shaping the perceptions of the young minds watching. One member leaned toward another, her voice low. She'll rise above it, like always, but these moments, they linger, not for her, but for the ones who need her message the most. Their silent resolve was clear. They would support Michelle in every way possible. But beneath their professionalism was a shared frustration, a quiet anger at how, even here, Michelle had to prove herself yet again. The atmosphere during the school tour was markedly different from the applause-filled auditorium. As Michelle walked through the pristine hallways, greeted by students and staff alike, she couldn't ignore the pointed glances from Mr. Hart. His presence, though silent for now, lingered like a shadow, casting a pall over the otherwise enthusiastic energy of the students. Michelle stopped by a bulletin board filled with student achievements and smiled as a young girl shyly explained her science project. But in the background, she caught snippets of Hart's commentary. "It's a fine project," he remarked to a colleague, "but let's not pretend these kids don't have advantages, others don't." His tone was casual, almost conversational, but the implications were unmistakable. With every hallway they passed, Michelle noticed the subtle digs, an offhand remark about opportunities as they walked by the scholarship board, a murmured comment about public figures being out of touch as they passed a classroom. The microaggressions were deliberate, yet designed to be deniable, carefully veiled in professionalism. Do you think subtle biases like Mr. Hart's are as harmful as overt prejudice? Share your take in the comments. The school auditorium was alive with anticipation as students filed in, their excited whispers filling the air. Rows of seats stretched back to the walls, packed with eager faces waiting for the moment Michelleobama would step onto the stage. The event felt monumental, the kind that would be recounted for years to come. When Michelle finally approached the podium, a wave of applause washed over the room. She stood confidently, scanning the sea of faces before her with a warm smile. "Good morning," she began, her tone friendly yet commanding. "Now, I see some of you look excited, and a few of you look like you were just pulled out of a math test. Don't worry, I'll keep this fun." Laughter rippled through the audience, breaking the initial tension. Michelle launched into her story, weaving moments of humor with hard-earned wisdom. She spoke of her childhood in the South Side of Chicago, painting vivid pictures of her parents' sacrifices and her relentless pursuit of education. "I didn't grow up in a fancy neighborhood or have tutors at my beck and call. What I had was determination, and parents who told me, 'You've got to work twice as hard to get half as far.'" Michelle was mid-sentence, sharing an anecdote about her college years, when the interruption came. "Excuse me, Mrs. Obama." Mr. Hart's voice cut through the air like a blade, loud enough to command attention, but steady enough to feign politeness. The room fell silent, the ripple of engagement frozen in an instant. Michelle turned to him, her expression calm, though. Her grip on the podium tightened ever so slightly. "Yes, Mr. Hart," she replied, her voice even and composed. Hart stood, straightening his blazer as he addressed her. "Your story is certainly compelling," he began, his tone measured but sharp. "But I think it's important to clarify something for the students. Would you say your success was entirely based on merit, or did you benefit from certain advantages along the way? Affirmative action, for instance, or other opportunities that might not be available to everyone?" An audible gasp rippled through the auditorium. Students exchanged stunned glances, their admiration for Michelle colliding with the discomfort of witnessing such a bold challenge. Hart's words hung in the air, calculated to undermine the very foundation of Michelle's message. hard work, resilience and perseverance. Michelle took a slow breath, her expression never wavering. "That's an interesting question, Mr. Hart," she began, her tone steady yet firm. "I've been asked it many times before. Let me assure you, and everyone in this room, that every step of my journey was earned, not given. I worked twice, as hard in spaces where I was doubted, judged and underestimated. My so-called advantage wasn't privilege, it was resilience." Michelle stood at the podium, the weight of Hart's words lingering in the air. The room was silent, the tension palpable as all eyes turned to her. She let a moment pass, steadying herself with a calm breath before speaking. "Mr. Hart, I appreciate your question," she began, her voice steady but deliberate. "It's one that has followed me throughout my life, and it's one I suspect many others in this room have encountered or will encounter someday. The idea that success can only be attributed to something handed to you, rather than something you've worked tirelessly for." Her gaze swept the audience, landing on the students. "Let me share something with you. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. My parents worked hard, harder than anyone should have to, just to give my brother and me a shot at a better life. I went to schools where resources were limited, where expectations were low, and where I often felt invisible in spaces that weren't built for me. But I didn't let that stop me. I studied, I worked, and I kept pushing forward, even when I was told I didn't belong." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "The truth is, I've faced barriers that many of you can't imagine. And yes, I've had mentors who believed in me and opened doors I didn't know existed. But those doors didn't open themselves. I had to knock, and sometimes I had to kick them down." Michelle turned back to Hart, her tone shifting slightly, firmer now, yet still calm. "So to answer your question, my success isn't the result of special privileges. It's the result of hard work, resilience, and the belief that I am just as deserving as anyone else in this world." The room was still, the power of her words hanging in the air, leaving little room for doubt or rebuttal. As Michelle's words settled over the auditorium, the atmosphere was electric with unspoken emotions. The students' reactions varied widely, a visible reflection of the tension that had been simmering throughout the event. In the front rows, several students of color nodded vigorously, their faces glowing with recognition and pride. A young girl, her hand resting on the edge of her desk, began to clap softly, sparking a ripple of applause among others who felt empowered by Michelle's story. Her words about resilience, hard work, and breaking through barriers resonated deeply with those who had faced their own forms of exclusion and bias. For them, Michelle wasn't just an icon, she was a mirror, showing them their own potential in a world that often doubted it. But not everyone shared this enthusiasm. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing glances at Mr. Hart, who remained seated, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His disapproving posture cast a shadow over the room, subtly influencing those who feared challenging his authority. For these students, their admiration for Michelle was tempered by uncertainty, caught between her powerful narrative and the unspoken pressure to align with someone as respected and intimidating as Hart. The tension lingered, setting the stage for what would come next. At the back of the auditorium, Principal Elena Carter shifted nervously, watching the growing tension unfold like a storm she couldn't control. She had envisioned this day as a triumph, a moment when Brookfield Academy would be celebrated for hosting someone as inspirational as Michelleobama. But now, the room felt like a battleground, and she found herself caught in the crossfire. As Michelle finished her response to Hart's pointed question, the divided reactions from the students rippled through the audience. Carter took a small step forward, clearing her throat to grab the microphone. "Thank you, Mrs. Obama, for your powerful insights," she began, her voice steady but lacking conviction. Let's refocus on the importance of education and the valuable lessons we can all learn here today. Her words were meant to diffuse the tension, but they landed flat, the attempt at neutrality only amplifying the unease in the room. She glanced briefly at Hart, whose expression remained unreadable, but firm, as if daring her to challenge him outright. Though Carter wanted to speak out against his behavior, the fear of upsetting the delicate balance of authority within the school held her back. Carter's hesitation didn't go unnoticed by Michelle, who remained calm but keenly aware of the principal's internal struggle. It was a moment Michelle had witnessed countless times before. Leaders, well-meaning but paralyzed by fear, choosing inaction over confrontation. As Michelle stood at the podium, addressing the divided audience, she felt a familiar ache stir within her. Hart's pointed remarks, the students' mixed reactions, and Principal Carter's hesitance to act, it all brought back moments she had buried long ago. She had faced this before, time and time again, in classrooms, boardrooms, and even in the White House. The faces may have changed, but the doubt, the dismissiveness, the questioning of her worth, it was the same. She let her eyes scan the room, pausing briefly on the students of color who were looking at her with hope and admiration. They reminded her of herself at their age, sitting in a classroom where she often felt invisible. She recalled a teacher from her own childhood who once told her she wasn't Princeton material, despite her stellar grades. That memory stung, even now, but it had fueled her determination to prove otherwise. Michelle's mind raced through other moments, the times she had been the only black woman in a room full of powerful people, her ideas overlooked until someone else repeated them. The way her achievements were often dismissed as a result of her husband's status rather than her own merit. And the countless times she had smiled through thinly veiled insults, knowing she couldn't afford to lose her composure. But as the weight of those memories pressed down on her, Michelle didn't falter. Instead, she drew strength from them. She remembered her mother's words. "You don't let anyone else define your worth. You know who you are." Looking back at the students, she realized that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every child in that room who had ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated. It was about showing them that they could rise above the doubts of others. Just as she had, her voice steadied as she continued speaking, her resolve evident in every word. She knew her presence here mattered, not for Mr. Hart, not for Principal Carter, but for the students, especially for the ones who needed to hear her story the most. Michelle stood taller, her pain transforming into power. This was bigger than the moment. It always had been. As Michelle's words continued to flow, the energy in the room began to shift. For many students of color seated in the audience, her story struck a deeply personal chord. They sat a little taller, their eyes fixed on her, hanging on to every word. They recognized the struggles she described, the moments of being dismissed, the uphill battle of proving oneself in spaces not designed to include them. A young boy, near the front, who had been scribbling in his notebook earlier, stopped writing and looked up, his expression one of newfound determination. Beside him, a girl with tightly braided hair nodded subtly, her fingers clutching the edge of her desk as if to steady herself against the waves of emotion washing over her. For the first time, they felt seen, not as students trying to fit into a world that often overlooked them, but as individuals full of potential waiting to be unlocked. Michelle's courage gave them hope, reminding them that their worth wasn't determined by the biases of others. Her words weren't just inspirational, they were transformative. She was living proof that they could rise above the doubt and prejudice they faced, just as she had, yet the room was still divided. While many students of color felt empowered by her message, others sat in silence, their expressions unreadable. A few grappled with their own ingrained biases or preconceived notions, unsure of how to process what they were hearing. The tension between hope and hesitation was palpable, but Michelle stayed focused on the students who needed her most. For them, this wasn't just a speech, it was a lifeline, a reminder that they had every right to dream big and push beyond the limits society tried to place on them. As the tension simmered in the auditorium, it became evident that Hart's remarks were more than just a personal slight. They were a window into a larger, deeply entrenched issue. His subtle undermining of Michelle's achievements wasn't simply about her. It reflected a pervasive mindset within the educational system, a mindset where authority figures, knowingly or unknowingly, perpetuated biases that shaped how students perceived themselves and their potential. Michelle's calm but firm response cut through the veneer of professionalism that often cloaked such prejudices. She didn't just address Hart's remarks. She dismantled the foundation they were built upon, exposing the dangerous implications of his words. Educators held immense influence over their students, not just in what they taught, but in how they treated and valued those they were meant to inspire. Hart's behavior was a stark reminder that biases, whether overt or subtle, could shape the aspirations of generations of young minds. Michelle looked at the students, her voice steady as she said, "Your worth is not determined by the limits others try to place on you. And no matter who questions your ability or your place in the world, remember this: you define your success, not them." Do you think a single person, like Michelle, can inspire change in such a deeply rooted system? Why or why not? Share your perspective in the comments. The room felt like it held its breath as Michelleobama took a deliberate step forward, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. All eyes were on her, students, teachers, and even Principal Carter, whose unease was evident as she lingered at the edge of the stage. Mr. Hart sat stiffly in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his disapproval clear. Michelle adjusted the microphone slightly and began, her voice measured but filled with quiet strength. "Mr. Hart, I appreciate your question earlier. It's one that I've encountered many times in my life, and I know I'm not alone in that." Her words were directed at him, but her eyes swept the audience, locking on individual faces as she spoke. "When I was young," she continued, "there were people who doubted me at every turn, teachers who told me I wasn't Princeton material, counselors who suggested I set my sights lower, people who looked at me, not at my abilities, not at my work ethic, but at my skin color and my background, and decided that my future had limits." Her voice didn't waver, but the emotion behind it was undeniable. "So, no, Mr. Hart, I didn't have special privileges. What I had were parents who worked harder than anyone should have to, who taught me that nothing would be handed to me. What I had was resilience, born from knowing that I had to be excellent just to be seen as equal." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Even students who had seemed hesitant earlier now leaned forward, captivated. Michelle continued, her tone unwavering, "And let's be honest, when we talk about privilege, we must ask, who truly has it? Is it the young girl from the south side of Chicago who had to fight for every opportunity? Or is it the people who never had to question whether they belonged in a space?" Her gaze landed squarely on Hart. "This isn't just about me, Mr. Hart. It's about the message we send to these students. Are we showing them that their worth is tied to someone else's bias? Or are we inspiring them to rise above it?" Hart's expression tightened, but he said nothing. The silence in the room wasn't just a void, it was filled with the undeniable truth of her words. Michelle stood tall, her voice steady as she shifted her focus. Her gaze remained unwavering as she addressed Mr. Hart directly, her words carrying both the weight of truth and a challenge he couldn't ignore. "Mr. Hart, I have to ask, as an educator, what message are you sending to these students?" The room remained silent, the question hanging heavily in the air. Students exchanged glances, unsure if anyone would dare to break the tension. Hart's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Michelle continued, her tone calm yet cutting through the stillness like a knife. Education is more than just teaching facts and assigning grades, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. It's about empowering students to think critically, to believe in themselves, and to push past the barriers society places in their way. But when biases like yours creep into the classroom, whether intentional or not, they do more than just create discomfort. They create limits. Limits on how students see themselves, limits on what they believe they can achieve. Michelle turned slightly, addressing the students now, though her words were clearly still meant for Hart. When someone in a position of authority plants seeds of doubt, it's not just one student who feels it. It's an entire generation that carries those scars. Hart finally spoke, his voice defensive but measured. Mrs. Obama, I don't think it's fair to imply that I've done anything but push my students to succeed. Michelle nodded, acknowledging his words, but refusing to let him off the hook. And yet your words today suggest otherwise. Because pushing students to succeed doesn't mean questioning their worth or their right to be here. It means lifting them up, even when you don't fully understand their journey. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in before continuing. Mr. Hart, are your biases helping these students grow, or are they holding them back? Are you challenging them to rise to their potential, or are you quietly reinforcing the barriers that make them feel like they don't belong? The room seemed to hold its breath. Michelle's pointed questions weren't just for Hart. They were a challenge to the entire system, one that allowed such prejudices to fester in places meant to inspire growth. The discomfort was palpable, but so was the shift in the room's energy. For a moment, the silence in the auditorium was deafening, Michelle's powerful words still resonating in the room. Then, from the third row, a student slowly stood. All eyes turned toward her, a slender girl with tightly braided hair and glasses that reflected the stage lights. She clutched her notebook to her chest, her hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Obama, she began, her voice quiet but steadying as she spoke. Thank you for what you just said. I think it's time someone else speaks up too. Michelle's gaze softened as she looked at the girl. Please, go ahead, she encouraged, her tone warm and inviting. The girl took a deep breath. My name is Elena, and I'm a junior here. I've been a student in Mr. Hart's classes for 2 years now, and I want to share what it's really been like for some of us. Her voice faltered slightly, but she pressed on. He's made students like me feel small, like no matter how hard we try, we'll never measure up. If we make a mistake, it's proof we don't belong. And when we succeed, it's because of special treatment. The room grew even quieter as Elena's words cut through the tension. She reached into her notebook and pulled out a stack of papers, her hands shaking. I'm not the only one. Some of us started keeping track, notes, emails, even recordings, of the things he's said and done. We didn't think anyone would believe us, but we hoped that maybe one day we'd have a chance to be heard. Eleanor's voice trembled, but her determination shone through. We're tired of being dismissed, of being told our work isn't enough, or that we're only here because someone gave us a handout. That's not true, and it's not fair, and it needs to stop. Elena's words hung in the air, her bravery, leaving the room in stunned silence. Michelle nodded slowly, her expression one of pride and deep respect. Thank you for speaking your truth, Elena, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Elena sat down, visibly relieved but glowing with newfound confidence. The weight of her testimony reverberated through the room, shattering the silence and planting the seeds for change. For a moment, the silence after Elena's testimony was so profound that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then a low murmur began to ripple through the crowd. It started with a few students whispering to one another, nodding in agreement, and quickly grew louder as others chimed in. "That happened to me, too," a boy in the middle row said, standing up hesitantly. His voice carried over the rising buzz. "Mr. Hart told me I should stick to sports instead of trying for advanced science classes." Another student raised her hand, but instead of waiting to be called on, she rose from her seat. "Last semester, he told me my essay was too polished and implied that someone else had written it for me," she said, her tone brimming with frustration. "I worked so hard on that, and he just dismissed it." More voices joined in, students standing one by one to share their stories of being doubted, dismissed, or outright insulted by Mr. Hart. Each story built upon the last, forming a collective tapestry of experiences that painted a clear picture of the systemic prejudice that had festered under his authority. Michelle watched with quiet pride as the students began to find their voices, their courage bolstered by Elena's bravery. This wasn't just a moment of revelation, it was a reckoning. At the edge of the stage, Principal Carter stood frozen, her face pale as she realized the extent of the issue that had been simmering beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Hart's previously stoic composure began to crack. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw tightening with every new accusation. "What's going on here is completely out of context," Hart interjected, his voice tight with frustration. But his attempt to defend himself fell flat, his words drowned out by the growing momentum of the students. Michelle stepped back to let the students take center stage, her presence both a guide and a witness. This was their moment, and she knew the power of their collective voices was far stronger than any one speech she could give. The energy in the room shifted completely, from one of tension and division to a powerful wave of unity. For the first time, the students stood together against the prejudice that had held them back, determined to demand change. As the students' voices filled the auditorium, Principal Elena Carter stood at the edge of the stage, her hands clasped tightly. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reckoning, and she knew the school's reputation, her leadership, and most importantly, the trust of the students were all on the line. Carter took a deep breath, stepped forward, and raised her hand to quiet the room. The murmurs gradually subsided as all eyes turned to her. For a moment she hesitated, her gaze briefly flickering to Mr. Hart, whose rigid expression betrayed his discomfort. But then her eyes landed on Elena, still seated, clutching her notebook. The determination in the young girl's face gave her the strength to continue. "First, I want to thank each and every student who has spoken up today," Carter began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It takes incredible courage to share what you've experienced, especially in an environment where you didn't feel heard. You deserve better. And today, I promise you, things are going to change." She turned to Michelleobama, her expression filled with gratitude and regret. "Mrs. Obama, I owe you an apology, not just for what happened here today, but for my hesitation to step in sooner. Your words and presence have reminded all of us, myself included, that silence in the face of injustice is complicity." Then turning back to the students, Carter's voice grew firmer. "As of today, we are implementing immediate changes. First, we will conduct a thorough investigation into the incidents brought to light today. Second, we will introduce mandatory bias training for all staff to ensure no student feels dismissed or disrespected in this school. Finally, we will create an anonymous reporting system so every student has a safe space to share their concerns without fear of retaliation." The room remained silent as her words sank in, but the tension began to shift into something else: relief, hope, accountability. This school is meant to be a place where all students, regardless of their background, feel empowered to succeed. Carter concluded, her voice resolute, and I will do everything in my power to make sure that happens. Her pledge marked a turning point, signaling to the students that change was finally on the horizon. As the room settled into an expectant hush, Michelleobama stepped forward once more, her presence commanding yet calming. The courage of the students, Principal Carter's bold commitment to change, and the collective energy in the auditorium had shifted the atmosphere entirely. She paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over everyone before speaking. What we've witnessed here today, Michelle began, her voice steady and filled with emotion, is not just about a single teacher, a single principal, or even a single school. It's about something much bigger, something that we, as individuals and as a society, must confront. Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on the students who had spoken up, on Principal Carter, and finally on Mr. Hart, who now sat with his arms crossed, avoiding her eyes. You see, she continued, power is not just about who holds the title or who gets to stand on the stage. True power comes from what you choose to do with it. Michelle paused, her words hanging in the air like a beacon. Then she delivered the statement that would define the day. It's not about who's in the room with power. It's about who chooses to use it for good. The silence that followed wasn't one of discomfort, but of reverence. The students sat up straighter, their expressions a mixture of awe and inspiration. The faculty, even those who had remained passive throughout the confrontation, seemed visibly moved. Principal Carter wiped away a tear, her earlier hesitance now replaced by a quiet determination. Michelle pressed on, her voice growing softer but no less powerful. Every one of you in this room has the ability to create change. Whether you're a teacher, a student, or a leader, you have the power to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. She turned back to the students, her expression warm but firm. Your voices matter. Your courage matters. What you do next matters. As she stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into applause. Students stood to their feet, clapping and cheering, their energy fueled by her words. Those iconic lines would echo beyond the walls of the auditorium, spreading to classrooms, communities, and conversations across the country. As Michelle stepped back from the podium, the auditorium seemed to hold its breath for a moment longer. Then, a wave of applause erupted, rising from a few students at first, but quickly spreading through the entire room. The sound was deafening, not just in volume, but in its significance, a collective acknowledgement of the power of her words and the bravery of those who had spoken up. Students from every corner of the room began to gravitate toward Michelle, eager to thank her, share their own stories, or simply stand in her presence. Elena was one of the first to approach, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You gave me the courage to finally speak up." Michelle knelt slightly to meet Elena's gaze. "You already had that courage, Elena," she said warmly. "All I did was remind you of it. Never forget how powerful your voice is." As more students gathered around, a boy stepped forward hesitantly. "Mrs. Obama," he began, his voice shaky, "I've always been afraid to say anything when people like Mr. Hart made comments like that. But today I feel like maybe I can." Michelle placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You can," she said firmly. "And when you do, you'll inspire others to do the same." While the students found unity and strength in the moment, the faculty sat in quieter reflection. Principal Carter wiped her eyes discreetly, visibly moved by the courage of her students and the transformative power of Michelle's message. Nearby, Mr. Hart stood awkwardly by the edge of the stage, his previously confident demeanor now replaced by discomfort. Without a word, he turned and exited the auditorium, his departure noticed but unacknowledged by most. The scene in the auditorium was one of rare unity, a moment where students and staff alike recognized the need for change. The tension that had once filled the room had been replaced with hope, determination, and a shared understanding of the work ahead. For Michelle, this wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. As she looked out at the sea of faces, she knew the seeds of change had been planted, and she could already see them taking root. The assembly had ended, but the energy lingered in the halls of Brookfield Academy. Students clustered in small groups, their voices animated as they reflected on what had just unfolded. Michelleobama walked through the polished corridors, her calm presence exuding strength and resilience. The walls seemed to echo with the power of her words, as though they had been etched into the very fabric of the school. Behind her, a voice called out hesitantly, "Mrs. Obama!" She turned to see Elena hurrying toward her, clutching her notebook tightly. The young girl's steps were hurried but purposeful, her expression a mix of gratitude and determination. When she caught up, she stopped, slightly out of breath but ready to speak. I wanted to thank you," Eleanor said, her voice soft but steady, "for everything, for giving me the courage to stand up today. I've been holding this in for so long, and I didn't think I could ever say it out loud." Michelle smiled, her warmth radiating reassurance. "Elena, you already had that courage," she said gently. "You just needed someone to remind you of it." Elena's eyes glistened as she nodded, clutching her notebook tighter. "I'll never forget this day," she said. Michelle placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "Good. Because today you reminded everyone in that room, myself included, what real bravery looks like." As Eleanor walked away, Michelle continued down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The students who passed her looked up with expressions of newfound respect and admiration. Some nodded shyly, others offered quiet thank yous. Michelle smiled to herself, knowing the impact of the day would extend far beyond these walls. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what would happen next. Have you ever had to call out injustice in a way that left you vulnerable? What gave you the strength to speak up? Let us know in the comments. The aftermath of the assembly sent ripples through Brookfield Academy like an earthquake. By the next morning, the administration issued a formal statement addressing the events that had unfolded. Mr. Hart had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending an official investigation into the allegations made during the assembly. The weight of the evidence, the testimonies from Elena and other students, the recordings, and Michelleobama's presence left no room for hesitation. Parents began flooding the school's phone lines, some expressing outrage over Hart's behavior, while others cautiously defended him, claiming his intentions were misunderstood. The division was clear, but Principal Carter was resolute. For the first time, she faced the situation head-on, stating firmly, "This school has a responsibility to uphold the values of equity and respect. Any behavior that undermines those values will not be tolerated." Carter's words carried weight, but it was the actions that followed that truly marked a turning point. The administration announced a comprehensive review of its policies to address systemic biases within the school. Among the first measures implemented was mandatory bias training for all faculty and staff, designed to challenge ingrained prejudices and foster a more inclusive environment. Additionally, an anonymous reporting system was introduced, giving students a safe and confidential platform to share their concerns without fear of retaliation. Posters announcing the new system were placed in every hallway, emphasizing the administration's commitment to protecting its students. For the students who had spoken up, this moment was validation. Eleanor, in particular, felt the weight of the change as she walked through the halls and saw her peers exchanging supportive nods and whispered words of encouragement. The fear and isolation she had once felt seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of empowerment and unity. Meanwhile, Michelleobama's visit continued to resonate within the school. Her words about power and resilience became a rallying cry, repeated in classrooms and hallways alike. Students began to believe that their voices mattered, and faculty members who had remained silent before started reflecting on their own roles in perpetuating or challenging bias. The swift action taken by the administration sent a powerful message. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept, it was something the school was finally willing to fight for. The events of the assembly reverberated far beyond the walls of Brookfield Academy, placing the school under the glaring spotlight of public scrutiny. Parents, alumni, and even local news outlets began to weigh in, questioning how such behavior had been allowed to persist for so long in an institution that prided itself on excellence and integrity. Principal Carter, aware of the mounting pressure and inspired by the courage of her students and Michelleobama's presence, knew it was time for meaningful action. In the days that followed, the school announced a sweeping policy overhaul, the first of its kind in its history. At the forefront was the implementation of mandatory bias training for all faculty and staff. These sessions, led by external experts, were designed to address implicit biases, challenge harmful stereotypes, and equip educators with tools to foster an inclusive environment. Principal Carter herself attended the first session, setting an example for the rest of the faculty. Next, the administration introduced a series of diversity initiatives aimed at promoting inclusivity throughout the school. Clubs and programs were launched to celebrate cultural diversity, and a new Diversity and Equity Committee was formed, comprising students, teachers, and parents. This committee was tasked with ensuring that the school's curriculum, events, and policies reflected its commitment to equity and respect for all backgrounds. Perhaps the most significant change was the establishment of an anonymous reporting system for students. Accessible both online and through physical drop boxes placed throughout the campus, the system provided a safe space for students to share their grievances without fear of retaliation. The message was clear. The administration was listening, and every student's voice mattered. These changes were not mere promises, they were tangible steps toward creating a safer, more equitable learning environment. For students like Elena, the changes represented hope and validation, a recognition that their voices had sparked something bigger than themselves. The policy overhaul marked a turning point for Brookfield Academy. It was no longer just a school that taught academic excellence. It was becoming a place that valued justice, inclusivity, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. And while the road ahead was long, the steps taken in the wake of Michelle's intervention were a testament to the power of unity and action. A few days after the assembly, Principal Elena Carter found herself standing outside the small conference room where Michelleobama was preparing to leave. The halls were quiet, the hum of the school day muted, yet Carter's thoughts were anything but. She had replayed the events of the assembly in her mind over and over, feeling the sting of her hesitation and the shame of her inaction. Now, as she prepared to face Michelle, she hoped to set things right. When she entered the room, Michelle greeted her with a warm but curious smile. "Principal Carter," she said, her tone calm and welcoming. "What can I do for you?" Carter hesitated for a moment, her hands clasping tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Obama," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I wanted to thank you for what you did for our students. But more importantly, I need to apologize for not stepping in sooner during the assembly, for hesitating when I should have acted." Michelle leaned forward, her expression encouraging but reserved, allowing Carter the space to continue. "I've Always thought of myself as someone who cares about my students, Carter admitted, her voice growing steadier. But I realize that caring isn't enough. Silence in the face of prejudice, even subtle prejudice, makes me complicit. And in that moment I failed them. I failed you. I'm sorry. Michelle's expression softened and she nodded. Acknowledging it is the first step, Principal Carter. What matters now is what you do going forward. Carter straightened. Determination, replacing the guilt in her eyes. I promise you, moving forward, I'll do more than just listen. I'll act, I'll lead by example and ensure this school is a place where every student feels seen, heard, and valued. As Michelle stood to leave, she extended her hand, her smile genuine. That's all anyone can ask for, she said. For Carter, the conversation marked the beginning of her own transformation, a commitment to becoming an active ally in the fight against prejudice. Her renewed resolve added hope to the school's journey toward true inclusivity and change. By the end of the week, a shaky but clear video of Michelleobama's speech during the assembly began to circulate on social media. Initially posted by a student with the caption, "This changed everything," the clip captured Michelle's powerful words and the bravery of the students who had spoken up. Within hours, it began to gain traction, shared by students, parents, and even educators across the country. Her iconic statement, "It's not about who's in the room with power, it's about who chooses to use it for good," became a rallying cry, quoted and reposted by thousands. Hashtags like "Abagi Power for Good," "Bug Education for All," and "Bias in Schools" started trending, with social media users sharing their own experiences of prejudice in educational spaces. News outlets quickly picked up the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the ongoing conversation about systemic bias in schools. Michelle's calm but firm confrontation of Mr. Hart, coupled with the students' testimonies, painted a vivid picture of the challenges faced by marginalized groups in educational institutions. Evening news programs featured excerpts from her speech, while panel discussions debated the broader implications of bias in schools. The story resonated far beyond Brookfield Academy, igniting national dialogue. Educators and administrators across the country began to examine their own practices, inspired by the swift actions taken by the school to address systemic issues. Students from other schools shared their own stories, many for the first time, empowered by the bravery of Elena and her peers. Michelle's message wasn't just a moment, it became a movement. It spurred a call for accountability, pushing schools nationwide to implement policies promoting equity and inclusivity. As the video continued to circulate, it was clear that her words had sparked more than conversation. They had ignited action. The impact of Michelleobama's visit lingered long after the assembly, sparking a quiet but undeniable transformation among the students at Brookfield Academy. In the weeks that followed, the energy around the school felt different, more alive, more hopeful. Students who had once felt invisible began to find their voices, emboldened by the bravery they had witnessed. Elena, who had stood up to speak during the assembly, became a leader among her peers. She started organizing a student-led diversity club, a safe space for students to share their experiences and discuss ways to promote inclusivity. The club, initially a small gathering of like-minded individuals, quickly grew as more students joined, inspired by the courage they had seen that day. "This isn't just about us," Elena would tell the group. "It's about making sure no one feels like they don't belong here." Elsewhere in the school, other students found their own ways to push past barriers. A boy who had been discouraged from pursuing advanced science classes signed up for a summer program in engineering. A girl who had been quietly discouraged from auditioning for the school play landed the lead role in the upcoming production. Each of them carried Michelle's message in their hearts. Your worth is not defined by someone else's bias. The impact wasn't limited to Brookfield Academy. Word of the students' stories, shared through social media and local news, inspired others beyond the school's walls. Messages of encouragement poured in from across the country, fueling a ripple effect of hope and determination. The students of Brookfield were no longer just dreamers, they were doers. With newfound confidence, they began to take risks, speak up, and support one another. Michelle's visit wasn't just a moment of inspiration, it became a catalyst for a future where those students could see themselves not as limited by bias, but as leaders breaking through it. As Michelle prepared to leave Brookfield Academy, she paused for a moment, taking in the energy that now filled the school. The halls that had once felt weighed down by tension and silent struggles now seemed brighter, alive with the voices of students who had found the courage to speak up and dream big. Reflecting on the day, Michelle's thoughts returned to a lesson her parents had instilled in her long ago. Resilience isn't just about enduring, it's about pushing forward, even when the odds are stacked against you. She thought of Elena's bravery, of Principal Carter's transformation, and of the students who now dared to envision futures they had once thought unattainable. Standing at the entrance of the school, she turned to one of her team members and said, "This is why we keep doing this. Change doesn't happen all at once. It starts with one voice, one action, one moment of courage, and it spreads." Looking back at the students gathered nearby, she spoke softly but with conviction. Change begins when someone is willing to challenge the status quo, no matter how daunting it seems, and when others see that courage, it inspires them to find their own. As she stepped into the car, her heart was filled with hope. Today wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something greater. As the car waited near the school's entrance, Michelle walked toward it, flanked by students and staff expressing their gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Obama," a young boy called out, his voice brimming with emotion. "You made me believe I can do something great." Principal Carter stood nearby, offering a heartfelt smile. "We won't forget what you've done here today," she said softly. "We'll do better, starting now." Michelle nodded, her expression warm but resolute. "It's a journey," she said, "but every step counts." Among the crowd, Eleanor stood slightly apart, clutching her notebook, but looking more confident than ever. As Michelle turned to wave goodbye, Eleanor lifted her hand in return, her eyes shining with determination. The moment was small but profound, a silent promise that the work started today would not end with her. As Michelle stepped into the car and it pulled away, she glanced back at the school, watching the students gathered together, their energy filled with hope and purpose. Her legacy wasn't in the words she had spoken, but in the fire she had ignited in their hearts, a reminder that one voice could spark countless others to rise. Do you believe education has the power to change minds and societies? What changes would you like to see in schools today? Share your ideas in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to hear more stories of resilience, courage, and justice.